Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Radio Dayz, a podcast radio program that delves into the world of terrestrial radio. It's DJs and on-air personality, and you, all fans of radio as a medium. Here's your host, Ron.
Hello and welcome to Radio Dayz The Podcast. You can hear this podcast on Buzzsprout, as well as all the major podcast platforms like Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts. You can also watch via YouTube, as well as my website, ronrobinsonstudios.com. In this episode, which is brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group, I'm going to be talking about and giving you an update on the status of my documentary series, Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio, which you may or may not know will be a historic look at radio as a medium. From its inception back in 1920 to current day, this documentary tells the story of radio, its history. Also today, I'm going to be sharing with you, as an adage to that, some of my favorite outtakes from this docuseries that didn't make the final cut. But before we get to the outtakes, like I said, the update on the status of Radio Dayz, the docuseries. From 2014 to late last year, I interviewed over 30 radio personalities and historians to help tell radio stories. Some of the names include Ken Calvert, Paul W. Smith, Dick Purton, Doug Podell, Duke Facour, Fred Jacobs, Dick Kernan, Jill Forsyth, Mike Staff, John O'Leary, Mike Halloran, JoJo Shuddy McGregor, Terry Foster, Chuck Santoni, Jim Davis, Art Regner, many more. Right now, as it stands, I'm all but completely finished editing this mammoth labor of love, and I'm currently looking for distributors to help me find a network or streaming service that will show this docuseries so everyone can finally be able to see this 5-part docuseries. It is 5 parts. I also want to add that in addition to the 5-part docuseries, I also edited a shorter movie version of this documentary that I hope to one day, very, very soon, show on a local movie screen. So stay tuned for that. My last hurdle in this production is to raise the money that Getty Images and some of the music services are charging for the licensing of some critical content that I need to tell this story. I have launched a GoFundMe page in hopes of raising some of the necessary funds. If you'd like to help out and donate and become an associate producer of this docuseries, the link to do so is in the description. If you are not able to, my ask, if you see or hear this, is to share it with as many people as possible within your sphere of influence. So thank you in advance. Every little bit helps. I really, really appreciate it. Now that you've been given an update, here's some of my favorite outtakes. I want to talk about some of my favorite outtakes from Radio Dayz, the docuseries. But before I get to my top 10, and I say top 10 loosely because there's so many outtakes that just didn't make the cut of this docuseries. Before we get to the top 10, I have a few honorable mentions. So first up here is as far as an honorary mention in the outtakes is country DJ Jill Forsyth talking about the radio war that took place between W4 and WYCD back in the 90s. Take a listen.
That country war was pretty exciting. That country war really gave us something to live for and work hard for, because we loved beating W4. And we thought they were just this old, boring country station, and that's kind of how the imaging played them out to be. And we were this exciting new station, playing this great new music with upbeat DJs. And I was actually hired over there, and I was going to be doing mornings with Michael J. Fox when the man that was going to hire me all of a sudden got fired. So I was going to make a flip to do mornings, and then it didn't work out that way. So then I ended up staying on Young Country, and the program director at the time, I had to take a $12,000 pay cut because all the people at W4 were out of a job, and I hadn't signed my contract, and it was a really nice contract, but I wanted to do mornings. And so I kind of lost out, but who would have known W4 was going to be going off the air then? But while we were both competition, it was really fun. It was fun looking at your show, comparing it to the other station, bigger bonuses for us when there was competition. There's just nothing like having competition in radio.
In this next clip, former WRIF PD Mark Pasman talks about the genesis of the Bruiser Band. Remember the Bruiser Band from Riff in the 70s and 80s? Check this out.
When George would come up with a parody tune, the musician would get to go in the studio, produce it up. That was like one of my best radio gigs ever. And then, I don't know who it was that says, well, why don't we get a band and get out there and play, make it a promotional arm of the radio station. The songs are red hot, and we ended up selling, doing a Bruiser Band album. Our opening gig was opening for Mitch Ryder at Pine Knob, full house, Major Storm. We had some great gigs, and we were a bunch of ragtag. My first bass player was one of the sales guys because we couldn't find anybody. Our Tommy Dalden from Promotions was on drums. So it was a real family thing. And it was also a way to be a part of, this radio juggernaut, but I'm still in a band. I'm still playing my guitar. I'm still, smiling at pretty girls. So it was a very special time promotionally, and for me, it was a gas.
In this last honorable mention, we hear from former CKLW jock Big Jim Edwards as he talks about the emergence of computers being used at radio stations. Check this out.
I put my first digital recorder into a radio station in New Jersey in 1993. I thought, this is just an amazing, how can they do this? We had a little floppy disk and a hard drive, and we were able to put a radio station together where we sequenced records digitally. Well, yeah, that was kind of the beginning of the end for the turntable, and cartridges came about, and we played songs off of what looked like 8 tracks, and then ultimately we ditched the 8 tracks and the cassettes and the records, and we put things on hard drives and we played them off of computers.
All right, now on to my top 10 favorite outtakes from Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio. At number 10, here is, he's a TV star now, but he started in radio. Here's Greg Russell talking about going on the air for the very first time in his career. I believe it was at WJR-FM. Yes, WJR-FM.
It was going from an automated station to a live station. So I was there just learning the stuff because they wanted me just to be ready for when they put me on the air. Well, one night I got a call going, Greg, the automation system broke down. We've got to put you on right now or tonight. So I was there at the station, and our sales manager came up and he says, why are you looking so nervous? I said, I got to go on tonight. I don't know, I'm just kind of freaked. And so we're in the Fisher building. They used to have this bar downstairs called Al Green's. He said, come with me. And so we go down there. He said, what do you like to drink? I said, rum and Coke. He says, okay. Let's get a Bacardi and Coke. And he took whatever he had. So had one. He said, how you feel? I said, feel a little bit better. He said, okay. What time are you on? I said, in an hour. He says, oh, give him a tray of 3 of those. Took upstairs and just kind of, relaxed it. Best show ever. But that's how it started. Yeah. Just, had a drink, cooled out, and just been having fun ever since.
My number 9 clip has Mike Staff, from Mike Staff Productions. In fact, if you're planning a wedding, check out Mike Staff. Here's Mike Staff explaining how radio changed in the 1990s with the emergence of grunge.
Yeah, music changed in the 90s because, as soon as Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, the rock world at least, was a completely different place. Like, the 80s was hanging on by a dear thread when it comes to the music. It was bands like Trickster and Britney Fox, and, they were just kind of hanger-on wannabes from the cool 80s stuff that Van Halen kind of brought into the culture. But when Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, it was like the glam was gone. And it became a little bit more serious, but the music was so unique, it was just so different. And then with that came the whole alternative music format, which was really interesting because you had a lot of hard rockin' grunge bands. Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, bands like that were clearly hard rock. But then the alternative rock scene brought in some some bands that were not quite that heavy and hard. You had bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who had some clear rock songs, but they also had stuff that didn't really fit on pop, like you couldn't really define it. REM was one of those bands. I mean, there's just a ton of those 80s kind of alternative bands that trying to figure out where they fit, so a whole new format came on, alternative rock. And then what happened with alternative rock is that it wasn't alternative after a couple of decades. It wasn't so different. It was so mainstream.
At number 8, here's WLLZ rock jock Doug Podell, Doc of Rock, as he talks about the changes that have occurred in the role that radio plays in promoting concerts for these rock bands. Check this out.
Yes, there is your guy who goes on the phone and just buys his tickets, but there's a lot of people who still need that information from radio, that hear that from their radio station, and it entices them to buy tickets. Just ask Live Nation that. Live Nation wouldn't be as successful as they are today with just social media. You know, radio has a big part of that. Now, back in the old days, when Metallica would do a pop-up concert in Chicago, they'd come to the top rock station and they'd announce it, and it would sell out in an hour. Now, they do it on their Facebook page. So there is that. But we're right there. We're following all of that social media. Social media has become a big part of radio. Had radio not incorporated social media, had it head stuck up its butt, and which we did for a long time, not incorporate it into your programming or just your thought process every day, we would not be very relevant.
At number 7, Greg Henson. You know him from WDFN, The Fan, remember him? I think he's in Grand Rapids now. Greg Henson talks about the specialty records that were released in the 1970s. I remember these. Here's Greg, check this out.
And I listened to a lot of country music. Ray Stevens, he had all those parody songs that were huge hits. But if you remember in the 70s, do you remember all these records that would come out? And it was like interviews. I remember interviewing Jaws. And they would use songs of the time, like Jaws. If I see you on the street, what will you do to me? And they put in a clip of the Eagles, "Get You Baby One of These Nights," and they were putting these kind of goofy records out. And here's the thing: when I was a kid, I got a $1.50 allowance every week, and every Friday night we'd go to Kmart at 15 in Livernois, and I would get a record and a Hot Wheel. And I got, my first one I ever got in the 70s was Rhinestone Cowboy by Glenn Campbell. Then we got You're in My Heart by Rod Stewart. I mean, all these, in the 70s, that was my life. Little 45s, sports, and Hot Wheels. And so I grew up listening to country music for the most part and watching Mac Davis, Glenn Campbell, Johnny Cash. They all had their own variety shows. Oh, Donnie and Marie, Tony Orlando and Dawn. All those 70s artists were so iconic because they tried to make crossovers out of all of them. And they put them on TV, they put them on the radio, and they were superstars.
At number 6, we have another WDFN alum. Here's Art Regner as he talks about how his infamous rants about the Detroit Lions went over in the Lions locker room. Check this out.
And so Mark Carrier would always say, well, come to the locker room. And so I would always go into the locker room. See, that's the thing. If you're going to criticize and you don't go into the locker room, then you have no credibility. None. None with me. It's easy to sit behind and flamethrow behind a microphone, and that's all you are is in that studio. That's not the way the game works. If you're going to say something about a guy, and you better walk into the room and let them face you. And so I can remember there were times when I would go into the Lions room where their PR staff would announce me. Say, here he is, here's DFN, here's the crazy one, here's Art Regner. And I cannot tell you how many times Lion players came up to me and would say, when we play at home, we can't get out to our cars fast enough to hear you going off. And I don't know if I want to beat the crap out of you or if I want to hug you, but I am laughing. It's so funny. but it was true. None of it was all spontaneous. It was all raw emotion. It just like poured out of me. And, so they never, ever pulled our credentials.
Here at number 5 is the late John O'Leary as he discusses the limited restrictions at WABX for selecting the music they played on that radio station. Check this out.
It was pretty wide open as to what we played. Now, when I got to ABX, that was similar, a card file. There were 3 or 4 different categories. But the big thing at ABX was this book. We had this huge book with thousands of pages in it, with the numbers, with a song title, the album it's on, and there was, I think, a number on every album, like B7 or whatever, which would give you, you'd run over and hope that the jock had put it in the right slot, in the right place on the wall. We had a wall full of albums. And we all had a grease pencil with a different color on it. So I was blue. So a 3-day separation, I mean, that's unheard of nowadays because they only play 400 songs. So obviously that doesn't work. A 3-day separation was the minimum before you would play an oldie again. And we're talking about thousands of songs, a page, say, of the band, okay? With 2 or 3 pages of band music on it. All different cuts, deep cuts, stuff people might know, stuff people did know. We had the option to pick whatever we wanted with a 3-day separation, and we cheated on that too if we felt like it.
At number 4, here's another radio legend, Paul W. Smith, talking about when he got fired from CKLW because he wasn't Canadian. Check this out.
Because of this battle across the border, and they had to announce that they were really a Canadian station, and then we had to play Canadian content music. So after so much Anne Murray and Gordon Lightfoot, you start to run low. I mean, no disrespect. I'm just saying being pigeonholed into playing just Canadian content music was not good. So they tried to switch over to talk after having been a music station, the Big 8, and all that. So it was a tough time. And we were sold to another Canadian company. I think it was a beer company, but I can't remember. And when I came in one morning, they said, "Oh, there's a big meeting today." And they said, "We're worried we're all going to get fired." And I said, "No, we're not all going to get fired. They're going to say they bought the station and that everything's going to stay the same. This is radio. This is Radio 101. Well, we go into the meeting and we were all fired that day. All the Americans were fired that day.
At number 3 is one of the favorite interviews I did for, in this whole docuseries. Number 3, Mr. Duke Fakur from the Four Tops, talking about how important the Funk Brothers and Motown was to the radio in the 60s and 70s. Check it out.
Motown went to radio. It started having more people listen to, I'd say, black music than a lot of other companies. They started out and they started going across the board. As soon as they started making those hits, people across the world and across the board liked Motown. It wasn't just black music. It wasn't just white music, pop music. It was music based on, with the lyrics and the beat and the way the music was formed. It appealed to everybody pretty much. The Funk Brothers was not just important to all the guys, they were so important to the whole Motown feeling and sound. They were, a lot of people don't understand how important they really were, or maybe they do now, to the Motown sound. They were originally jazz players, which means they could be very flexible with notes and music and all. When they got to Motown, they had to learn, just like we had to learn how to record in the way that Motown wanted them to. And they got so good at it. Once the producer was happy with their recording, they would always say, "Look, we're going to take one more." And they would take one more, and that would always be the one. They would add just that little extra something about them. They were artists.
The number 2 outtake that didn't make the docuseries is from the National Radio Hall of Fame, Dick Purton, as he talks about one of his favorite accomplishments in radio. Before he even came to Detroit, Dick Purton was responsible for bringing the Beatles to Cincinnati back in '64.
I was being interviewed one night by a station from Indianapolis, and I had dinner with the program director, and he was trying to get me to move from Cincinnati to Indianapolis. This is before I ever got here in Detroit.
And he happened to say to me, who's got the Beatles for Cincinnati? And this is 1964. And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, we've got them for Indianapolis. And I said, you do? I said, how'd you do that? He said, very simple. Just called their agent in New York and talked to him, discussed it, picked a date, time, et cetera, et cetera. He said, you might be able to do the same thing. So the next morning, after I got off the air at 10, because I did mornings at WSAI in Cincinnati, so I called, I found out their agency, William Morris or whatever the agency was, and I called up and I introduced myself and I said, we're interested in sponsoring the Beatles on the tour, the first tour, the 1964 tour. So I got to, the bottom line is, all it required was a venue, a date, money. Of course, the money was, I had to come up with $12,500, $12,500, and a cashier's check, and then another $12,500 the night of the concert.
And at number one, this is likely my favorite outtake that didn't make this series. Here's another National Radio Hall of Famer, Mr. Fred Jacobs, telling a great Arthur P. story from when Fred was the PD at WRIF in Detroit. Check this out.
I mean, I remember the first time Stevie Ray Vaughan's Pride and Joy ended up on my desk. And I took one listen to that song and I just said, holy crap, this is so great. And Arthur was on the air and I walked it down to him and I said, you are going to, this is an Art Penhallow song, you are going to love this. I want you to play it next. And he said, okay, great, absolutely. Arthur did a real nice setup, played Pride and Joy. The song ends, there's a bit of a pause, the mic opens, and Art goes, that was so good, I'm gonna play it again. Picked up the tone arm and put it back down on the record and played Pride and Joy a second time in a row. And I heard people talk about that moment years later. It was one of those spontaneous moments that happened, but that people remember.
So there you have it. Some of my favorite outtakes from Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio. I hope you enjoyed those. I remind you to be on the lookout for Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio coming very, very soon. And again, if you know someone who can help me out in finding a distributor for this docuseries, or you want to help donate to the GoFundMe page that can be found in the description, I would greatly appreciate it. If you are unable to, for whatever reason, my ask is that if you're watching this, that you share it with as many people as you can within your sphere of influence. Thank you, thank you, thank you in advance. And thank you for checking out this episode of Radio Dayz The Podcast. Today's show was brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group. Are you looking to buy or refinance your home and have questions that need answers now? Pick up the phone. Call Brian Allord, 810-444-6466. That's 810-444-6466. Tell him Ron sent you. Today's show is produced by Ron Robinson Studios. If you need professional marketing videos or professional photography headshots, maybe you need drone video, head over to ronrobinsonstudios.com. You can also hear previous episodes of Radio Dayz, the streamcast there as well. Also, if you'd like to learn more about the upcoming documentary about the history of radio, as we talked about today, go check out Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio. Click that link under the documentaries tab at ronrobinsonstudios.com. Thanks for checking out the show. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.
You can't go. All the plants are going to die.